All right, so today we're going to dive into this book by Robert Nozick called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's one of those that like everybody's heard of, but maybe not everyone's actually read.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough one to get through,
Yeah.
but it's worth it. It tackles this really big question. What's the proper role of the state? How much power should it actually have over individuals?
Right, and he does this by like starting off with this thought experiment, this idea of a state of nature, right? Like imagine there's no government at all.
Yeah, he's kind of riffing on some of those classic political philosophers like Locke, who talked about, individuals living in a pre-political state, relying on their own reason and self-preservation.
Okay.
But Nozick takes it a step further. He imagines these protective associations forming where people come together to safeguard their rights and their interests.
So even in this like chaotic state of nature, there's still this drive towards some kind of order.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where he brings in this idea of invisible hand explanations. Have you heard of that before?
I mean, I think so, like in economics, right?
Yeah, it's like from Adam Smith, who talked about how markets can self-regulate without a central authority directing everything. Nozick applies this to the state of nature, arguing that a minimal state can actually emerge organically.
Okay.
Like those flocks of birds that move in sync without a leader.
Yeah. Yes, you're saying.
It's pretty wild. For example, think about language. No one sat down and created English, right?
Right.
It just developed through interactions between individuals. No grand plan, but this complex system emerged.
It's like the invisible hand at work.
Exactly. So these protective associations, they start to get more organized, more powerful, and eventually one becomes dominant. Boom. The beginnings of a minimal state.
So we're going from like total anarchy to this minimal state.
Right, but it's not some huge bureaucracy. Nozick calls it the night-watchman state.
Okay.
Its only job is to protect against violence, theft, fraud, the basics. Basically, it's just a referee making sure there's a fair playing field.
And that's where individual rights become really important, right?
Absolutely. Nozick argues that individuals have inherent rights that can't be violated.
Even by the state.
Even by the state. He gives these really thought-provoking examples, like even if you could fully compensate someone for a harm, certain actions might still be wrong.
Okay, like what kind of examples?
Like, say, paying someone to punch them in the face. Just because you could pay them doesn't make it morally right.
Right, so there's this line between what's permissible in a transaction and what's morally acceptable.
Exactly. And then he throws in this crazy thought experiment, the experience machine. Imagine a device that could give you any experience you want, perfectly simulated.
Whoa, that's trippy.
Would you plug in, trade real life for guaranteed happiness, even if it's all fake?
I don't know. It's tempting, but like, wouldn't you be missing something real?
That's Nozick's point. He's saying that genuine human experience, even with all its messiness, is valuable.
Yeah, I get that. It's like choosing a curated Instagram feed over actual life.
Exactly. So we're not just talking about the state here, but also how we make choices and what we value in life.
Okay, so that's the state of nature, the minimal state, and now we're getting into like the bigger picture of what makes a meaningful life.
Right. But there's more. He tackles distributive justice next. How should goods and resources be allocated?
Oh, that's a big one. Fairness, equality, all that.
Yeah, and this is where his famous entitlement theory comes in.
Okay, so what's that all about?
He says a just distribution isn't about achieving a specific pattern or outcome.
Okay.
It's about whether the holdings were acquired and transferred justly.
Huh. So even if some people end up with more than others, as long as it happened through fair processes, it's okay.
That's the basic idea. He uses this really memorable example, the Wilt Chamberlain argument. Imagine Wilt Chamberlain in the 70s.
Okay, I can picture.
Super popular basketball player. People pay a little extra to see him play. He becomes super wealthy. Nozick says this is just, even if it leads to inequality, because it came from voluntary transactions.
It's definitely a different way to think about things.
Right. It challenges that idea of needing a predetermined pattern of wealth distribution.
So it's more about the process than the end result.
Exactly. But he doesn't just stop there. He addresses criticisms, brings in other philosophers like Amartya Sen to make things even more nuanced.
Okay, hold on. I need you to explain that a bit. What's Sen's take on all this?
Well, Sen argues that you can't organize society perfectly based only on individual preferences.
Interesting.
Like, trying to satisfy everyone's desires perfectly is basically impossible. It's like a Rubik's Cube where each square is a different person's ideal outcome. Someone's always going to feel like they got a bad deal.
That's a good analogy. Makes you think about the limits of any system, right?
Exactly. It gets you thinking, how can any system be truly fair if you can't make everyone happy?
Right. That's a great point. It seems like Nozick is always pushing us to think beyond simple solutions.
Absolutely. And just when you think you've got him figured out, he throws in another curveball, Utopia.
Oh, here we go. Utopia. So, does he lay out a blueprint for the perfect society?
Well, not exactly. It's not really Nozick's style to give us a step-by-step guide. Instead, he presents what he calls a framework for utopia. It allows for a ton of different communities, each with its own values and goals.
So instead of one utopia for everyone, it's more like choose your own adventure utopia.
Yeah, I like that. It's about maximizing individual choice. Let people create communities that align with their own vision of a good life. He introduces this idea of filter devices, mechanisms that help sort people into communities that share their values.
Filter devices. Okay, I'm intrigued. So it's like a matchmaking service for utopian communities. How does that work?
Imagine you're really passionate about, say, environmental sustainability and living in a community. A filter device could connect you with other people who feel the same way, leading you to a community that prioritizes those things.
So it's about finding your tribe, but in a way that respects individual autonomy.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical departure from the traditional idea of utopia as this homogenous society where everyone has to conform. Nozick is saying, let 1,000 utopias bloom.
Wow, that's a powerful image. But he doesn't stop there, does he? There's something about design devices too, right?
Right. Those are more intentional ways to create communities with specific goals, like a group of people get together to form a community focused on, say, art or scientific exploration.
Okay, so it's like intentional community building, but still within this framework of choice. People are free to join or leave as they see fit.
Exactly. It's fascinating how he combines individual freedom with community and even a touch of social engineering. It makes you wonder, though, could this kind of utopia actually work within the limits of that minimal state he's so keen on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Can you have this diverse, decentralized utopia and still have a minimal state?
Well, that's one of the most interesting parts of his argument. He actually believes that this utopia could function within a minimal state. The state wouldn't dictate the values or structures of these communities, it just provides the framework for them to exist.
So it's like a meta-utopia, utopia of utopias. This is getting pretty complex. We've gone from anarchy to the minimal state to utopia. Where does it all leave us? How do we apply Nozick's thinking to the real world?
That's a great question. I think the important thing to remember is that Nozick isn't trying to give us a step-by-step guide to building a perfect society. Instead, he's giving us tools to think about these really complicated issues of politics, individual rights, and how we make choices.
Okay, so it's more about giving us a new perspective than a concrete plan.
Exactly. For instance, take the entitlement theory. It's an interesting idea that voluntary exchanges lead to just outcomes. But what happens when those exchanges create huge inequalities?
Right, that's a big question. Does freedom of choice sometimes lead to problems?
That's the heart of the debate Nozick started. It's about the tension between individual freedom and social equality. Can you have too much freedom? Does it sometimes come at the expense of others?
So there are no easy answers.
Not really. And his vision of utopia is so different from the classic idea of one perfect society. He wants a space for lots of different communities to thrive, each based on their own values. But could that lead to fragmentation? Conflict between groups? How do you balance individual freedom with social cohesion?
So many questions.
Right. Nozick gives us a framework, but the details are up for debate. It's a reminder that these questions of freedom, justice, and the state aren't just academic debates, they impact all of us.
And it's our responsibility to grapple with them, right? To think critically about the world we want to live in.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the most valuable things about Nozick's work. It pushes us to examine our own assumptions and engage in these discussions in a thoughtful and nuanced way.
So as we wrap up our exploration of anarchy, state, and utopia, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? It feels like there's so much to unpack.
I think the biggest takeaway is that Nozick's work is deeply thought-provoking, challenging, and even frustrating at times. But it's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the fundamental debates in political philosophy. He forces you to think about your own views on freedom, justice, and the role of the state. And that's a powerful legacy.
Definitely. And he leaves us with so many questions to ponder. Like, if you could create your own ideal community within Nozick's framework, what would it be like? What values would be most important? And how would you balance individual liberty with the needs of the community?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's one worth thinking about. It can help us understand our own values and what we truly believe in. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into anarchy, state, and utopia. Hopefully, it sparked your curiosity and made you want to explore these ideas further.
Thanks for listening.
It really does. And his vision of utopia is so different from that classic idea of one perfect society. He wants a space for all sorts of different communities to thrive, each based on its own set of values. But could that lead to fragmentation? Conflict between groups?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
How do you balance individual freedom with the need for some kind of social cohesion?
That's where the real challenge comes in. I think Nozick provides this framework, but he doesn't really give us all the answers. The details of implementation are up for debate.
Right. It's not a step-by-step guide.
Exactly. Like, how do you design those filter devices to make sure they're fair and don't lead to discrimination? And what happens when the values of different communities clash? These are questions we need to think about.
Definitely. It's like he's giving us the tools to have these conversations, to think critically about how we build a better world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about Nozick's work. He's not just presenting a rigid ideology. He wants us to engage with these ideas, wrestle with them, and come up with our own answers.
So as we wrap up this exploration of anarchy, state, and utopia, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? It feels like there's so much to unpack.
I think the biggest takeaway is that Nozick's work is deeply thought-provoking. It's challenging and even frustrating at times. But it's essential reading if you want to understand those fundamental debates in political philosophy. He forces you to think about your own views on freedom, justice, and the role of the state. And that's a powerful legacy.
Definitely. And he leaves us with so many questions to ponder. Like, if you could create your own ideal community within Nozick's framework, what would it be like? What values would be most important? And how would you balance individual liberty with the needs of the community?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's one worth thinking about. It can help us understand our own values and what we truly believe in. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into anarchy, state, and utopia. Hopefully it sparked your curiosity and made you want to explore these ideas further.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it really makes you think. It stays with you. It's not just a book you read and put away. You keep coming back to it.
Right. Like you find yourself thinking about those arguments weeks later.
Yeah.
And you see the world a little differently.
Exactly. And I think it's partly because of the way he writes. He's so rigorous. He doesn't let any idea go unexplored.
He's not afraid to tackle the big questions either.
Mm-hmm.
The foundations of the state, individual rights, utopia. He just goes for it.
And he's so clear in his thinking. Even when it gets really abstract, he finds ways to make it understandable. He uses thought experiments, examples, even some humor to keep things interesting.
He's also really good at acknowledging the weaknesses in his own arguments, which I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. He's not afraid to engage with the criticisms and the opposing viewpoints.
So it feels more like a conversation than a lecture.
Exactly. He's not trying to preach. He wants you to think for yourself.
And in that sense, Anarchy, State, and Utopia is more than just a philosophy book. It's like this invitation to have a real discussion about the kind of society we want.
That's a good way to put it. It reminds us that these questions about freedom, justice, the role of the state, they're not just theoretical. They have real consequences for how we live our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this. What would your ideal community look like within Nozick's framework?
Ooh, that's a good one. What values would it prioritize? How would it balance individual freedom with the needs of the group?
It's a thought-provoking question, right?
Yeah.
It gets you thinking about your own beliefs and what you truly value.
Definitely. And who knows? Maybe by thinking about these questions, we can all contribute to a world that's a little bit closer to Nozick's vision, a world where we have both freedom and a sense of belonging.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into anarchy, state, and utopia. We hope you've enjoyed it.
And we hope it's inspired you to learn more.
Thanks for listening.